Okay, welcome back. We're in class. Sometimes we're on deck, sometimes we're in class. The excitement never ends. Exam 78, Section 1. We're going to do questions 5 through 10. Question number 5, the issue presented. The reasoning above calls into question a conclusion drawn from statistical data by. Okay, so the issue is to describe the type of reasoning employed. Okay, so reasoning could be of a counterexample, could be of an analogy, could be attacking a premise. So the rest you describe how the reasoning calls a conclusion into question. So I have my slash marks. I have 3 slash marks. Now I begin to read. Researchers asked 150-year-olds and 120-year-olds whether they gave blood. Okay, nobody's lost yet. Because nearly twice as many 50-year-olds as 20-year-olds reported that they sometimes gave blood, the researchers concluded that on average, 50-year-olds are more altruistic than 20 years old. So all they're doing right there is they're not taking any position. They're simply describing what the researchers' findings were and what conclusions they reached. And it would be very helpful if you don't know what altruism is. It'd be very helpful if we went and you looked it up. They like that word. Okay, here we go. But there is reasons for skepticism. That's my conclusion, right? There is now I want to know, so why is there reason for skepticism? There is reason for skepticism. Here it comes. Many people hesitate to admit that their behavior does not conform to social expectations. Okay, so that's the reasoning. In other words, the reasoning which that last sentence here is the reasoning in support of the conclusion that there's skepticism, and that reasoning is that many of us hesitate to admit that our behavior does not conform to social expectations. And so that view casts a new light on the veracity, the reliability of the data. I mean, on the most basic level, what would happen if people were lying? What if, for whatever reasons, people in their 20s lied about this, or people in the 50s lied about this? That would cast doubt. So I'm done. Don't know what words they're going to use. Again, for briefing exercise, go directly to the credited answer choice. Again, the prime directive here is the analysis has to be done before you look at the answer choices. So go to B. B is the answer. That the reasoning above calls into question a conclusion drawn from the statistical data by offering an alternative explanation of some of the data. Yes, it does. The alternative explanation of some of the data is that whether it's the young folks or the older folks or both, that many of us hesitate to admit that our behavior fails to conform to societal expectations. So young people, it maybe it's common among young people not to give blood, and you're bragging about not to give blood. Maybe among people my age, it's popular to give blood, and so you're saying, okay, I gave blood because I want to conform to societal I don't want to be seen as denying it. So B is the answer. Let's look at the other choice. Again, you got to get B. Stay as long on B as you have to get B before you look at any choice. A, showing that the data are based on an unrepresentative sample. No, it's not unrepresentative. You're taking groups in their 20s and their 50s. You might say that 100, number 100 may not be enough. You might say that, but that wouldn't be unrepresentative. That would be undersampled. You'd have too few people. But here, that showing, it doesn't show that the data, it's not attacking. You know what I'm saying? If the last sentence actually attacked that, then you'd have your answer. But the last sentence is not attacking that. It's not paying any attention to that. You were being specifically asked how this person proceeded on that final line. C, does this person proceed by showing that one cannot directly observe altruism? No. This person proceeds by pointing out there may be a hidden agenda that the groups have. D, does this person proceed by criticizing the motives of the researchers? No, there's no criticism of the motives of the researcher. And E, does it offer a specific counterexample? And the answer is it does not offer a counterexample. So the answer there is B. Question number 6. The dialogue provides the most support for the claim that Mario and Renette disagree over. So, okay, this is, again, you're going to get this on your test. You either agree or disagree about the facts of the conclusion. So as you read this, read for the facts of the conclusions. Mario, always have your slash marks there. I see that the only rug store in Glendale has gone out of business. Stop. I've got a slash mark. Okay, it's gone out of business. Evidently, there's little demand for rugs in Glendale. Well, that's Mario's conclusion. Mario concludes on the basis that the one rug store went out of business that there's not much demand for rugs. And that could be true, but it doesn't have to be true. So, if you're planning to open a new business there, rugs would be one product to avoid. And that ends up as being the ultimate conclusion. Mario tells us, don't open up a rug store because the one rug store there went out of business. Renee responds to that. It's true that the store is gone, so he's not questioning the premise of the reasoning. But its closing had little to do with the product it sold. It had little to do with the rugs. All this means is that the market for rugs in Glendale is now wide open. So they're disagreeing about the conclusion. Mario's conclusion is that you don't want to sell rugs there. Renee's position is the market's wide open for rugs. That's what they disagree about. That's got to be in your mind. Now, when you see the answer choice, which here is B, it is a good idea to open up a rug store in Glendale. How clear is that? This test is not all, some of this test really is pretty straightforward. So in my world, I would have gotten the B and pulled the trigger, and I'm not suggesting everyone would do that. It's just real clear. I'm okay with being wrong, where I'm beyond a reasonable doubt. Because if I'm beyond a reasonable doubt, it follows, it's very, very unlikely I'll be wrong. Okay. Let's look at the other choices. But you get that Mario is saying it's not a good idea to open the rug store, and Renee is saying it is a good idea to open a rug store. A, do they disagree that the rug store in Glendale sold rugs of inferior quality? I have no clue why anybody would ever pick A, so don't do it. There's nothing in here about quality. C, is it possible to determine the market for rugs in Glendale? There's no reason to believe they disagree with that. The issue hasn't been raised as to the market for rugs in Glendale. D, any other stores have gone out of business in Glendale? That's just silly. This is about the rug store. And E, rug stores can close because of an insufficient demand for rugs. They don't disagree with that. I'm sure they would both agree that it can do that. But again, here there's just no serious competition. Again, with that C, is it possible to determine the market for rugs? Why would they disagree? I'm sure they could both agree that it's possible to determine the market. Okay, so the answer is B. Question number 7. Which one of the following most accurately describes a flaw in the editorial's argument? So I've got 1, 2, 3 slash marks in the end, and now I'm looking for a flaw. So again, I read the law enlightened by the issue. Right, there's a flaw. Let me see if I can get it. The city council is considering increasing the amount of air traffic allowed at the airport beyond its original design capacity. Stop. There's a slash mark there, stop. We're in New York, LaGuardia. You think, okay, they're thinking about allowing more air traffic going in there beyond its original design capacity. Okay. Several council members say that this increase would not decrease safety, as it would be accompanied by the purchase of the latest safety technology. Stop. If you need to reread it. But you get some people saying, no, it's not going to be, it's fine to have more planes because we have more advanced technology. I got it. But in fact, it would decrease safety. That is the conclusion. That is what I'm attacking. So the author's saying it will decrease safety, and we're taking the position you have not made that case. What's going to follow was the author's reasoning in support of the author's conclusion that the increase in traffic here is going to decrease safety, and we're going to attack that here. So here it comes. The author now relies on this. Numerous studies conducted 30 years ago. Well, doors wide open. Is it fair to say that a study conducted 30 years ago with respect to airport safety might be outdated? Okay, but that's the way you're reading. Numerous studies conducted 30 years ago show that safety was reduced at every airport where the permitted level of traffic was increased beyond the airport's original design capacity, even when those airports made use of the latest safety technology. It just screams at you. Well, sure, but the latest safety technology 30 years ago, it may well be distinguishable from the latest safety technology today. That's the flaw. It's just a question of finding the words they use. So you stop. If you've got that kind of clarity, you get to the answer choice, you pick it, you pull the trigger, and you get out of there. So here, let's go with what they came up with. B is the answer. B. The argument fails to consider the possibility that whether an airport can allow more air traffic than it was originally designed for without reducing safety depends largely on what the latest technology is. And that absolutely does ignore that. That would be so clear to me. All right, so again, on question 6 and question 7, I'd be picking B on both of them. I'd be pulling the trigger, and I'd be saving time, and I'd be getting things right. Let's see what else they come up with. But again, you gotta understand B. If you know you're sitting there and B is a fog, go get a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, do whatever you do, come back and wait till that fog goes away. A, is this the flaw? The argument draws a conclusion on the basis of a general statement that has in turn been inferred from a very limited amount of particular instances. I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue where they're going with that. That is certainly not the flaw here. Its conclusion is that safety would decrease. That's its conclusion. It's not based on a general statement. It's based on, they had this survey, it showed it wasn't, 30 years ago it didn't work. C, the argument fails to consider the possibility that the city council members who support the increase are aware of the studies that were conducted 30 years ago. Well, that's not relevant. Whether the city council members are aware or not aware of the prior study is not relevant to, is it going to compromise safety to do this now? Okay. D, the argument confuses an absence of evidence for the claim that the airport can safely permit air traffic in excess of its original design capacity with the existence of evidence against this claim, and it does no such thing. The argument here rests on tangible evidence. This is just it's not a lack of evidence. There is tangible evidence that 30 years ago, this was not a safe procedure to follow. So it's fine. The argument is fine. It's just the flaw is that it's 30 years ago. E, the argument fails to consider that a slight increase in safety risks might be acceptable if it yields overriding benefits of another kind. Again, that's not the flaw here. The flaw is not that it fails to consider a slight increase. The flaw here is that it's relying on possibly outdated data. So the answer to number 7 is B. Question number 8. Which one of the following most logically completes the argument? We're going to logically complete this. Just let one more sentence out. I have all my slash marks in, so again, just put those slash marks everywhere there's punctuation in advance of reading the argument or in advance of reading the information. Philosopher. It has been argued that because particular moral codes differ between cultures, morality must be entirely a product of culture and cannot be grounded in some universal nature. That kind of has an ugly feel to it. So again, in my world, it's just fine. If that has an ugly feel to it, come back to it. We're going to stay with it. And if you reread it, that's fine. Just be aware rereading takes time. So the philosophy thing, it's been argued that because particular moral codes, I think moral codes is important here because they differ between cultures. Because of that, morality must be entirely a product of that culture. And so morality is contingent upon, moral codes are different in cultures, and therefore morality must be a product of the culture, not something that's universal. This argument is flawed. Now I have the position of the author. That's not correct. It is not a correct statement to say because moral codes are different, it prevents there being universal morality. And here you go. Research suggests that certain moral attitudes, now we went from moral codes, remember? Now we're talking about moral attitudes. Research suggests that certain moral attitudes, and they give me examples now, such as disapproval of unfairness and cruelty, are shared across all cultures. So maybe the moral code is different, but the moral attitudes are the same. That's where we got so far. And just as certain universal tastes, like sweetness and saltiness, can, in different moral contexts, provide the basis for many different cuisines. Well, if you're going to now analogize to saltiness and sweetness and how that is a predicate for enjoying different types of cuisines, then, or haven't you just analogized that moral attitudes providing the same basis for moral codes, that the moral codes may come out of the moral attitudes, and the moral attitudes are universal. And I'm done. I don't know the exact words you're going to use. It does seem to me this is a tougher issue to solve, but I'm done. And if I were to look at A, B, C, D, and E, and I were to recognize nothing, I'd pick one of them and I'd get out of there. But here we're briefing. So the answer is C. And you logically complete this by saying a variety of moral codes can be based in shared moral attitudes. And that's where we were, right? You're saying the moral codes, which in the argument are universal, right? Meaning the codes were unfairness and cruelty, and we reject that. That those codes can be based in shared moral attitudes, in which case the moral attitudes themselves could be universal. Again, it's fine. If you want to stay, if you are struggling with it, struggle with it, but don't get religion. You're not, unless you're 1.5% of the test takers, you're not here to get 100. You're here to go to law school. So again, if you don't understand C, do you get that A and B and D and E become more plausible because you never understood C? So you got to understand C. A, moral codes tend to be based in the specific context in which they arise, that would not flow from what we have just read, at least not in my mind. Whether or not moral codes tend to be based in specific contexts, I don't have a clue in which they arise. B, the moral codes of most cultures resemble each other in many respects, and that's way too broad. I have no knowledge whether the moral codes of most culture resemble each other in many respects. D, it is possible to understand the basis of moral codes of different cultures. We're not trying to understand it, we're just trying to identify whether or not they're universal or not. And E, moral attitudes can be adapted to suit the moral codes of many different cultures. This is not about adaptation. This is simply about whether or not the moral attitudes we have can provide a basis for a universal moral code. So, but again, I'm fine with number 8, just leaving it alone. So the answer is C. Number 9, the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the ground. So again, it's a flaw issue. And here we go. In a recent field study of prairie plants, the more plant species a prairie plot had, the more vigorous the plants grew and the better the soil retain nutrients, and I would need to reread that. So we have a recent study of prairie plants, okay, and the more plant species that a plot had, so the more plant species, different types of plants that the plot had, the more vigorous the plants grew, and the better the soil. So there's a relationship here between the more different types of species and the better outcome that you had with respect to the plants grew vigorously and the soil retained nutrients. Okay, thus having more plant species improves a prairie's ability to support plant life, and this is very common. Again, the hypothetical doesn't matter. The principle is they lead you from left to right. They lead you as though you're reading cause and effect. They read you. A representative person is going to read this and say, well, okay, so it's the increase in species that's having this effect on the soil. But you want to be lawyers. So while that is the way it reads from left to right, there is nothing in this argument that precludes the possibility that because the soil itself was so rich, that there's such great soil, a different variety of species grew up there. So this is cause and effect. This is mistaking a correlation, which is a different species and rich soil, for causation that the rich species is responsible, that the multiple, the different species is responsible for the rich soil, and that's it. So again, it's just recognizing the words go directly to here, A. It infers of two correlated phenomena, X and Y, that X causes Y without understanding whether Y causes X. Sure, X is the number of species, Y is that wonderful soil that we want. The person here infers that the species causes that wonderful soil and misses the possibility that the wonderful soil brought about the species. A is the answer, and that's like good night, lights out, I'm on A, I'm gone. So, maybe 8 was a pain in the ass, but 6, 7, and 9 are very inviting, 3 choices, each of which I would have pulled the trigger on with a B, and an A. That's saving a lot of time. Looking at 9, the other choices, but again, I would never be doing this. B, fails to describe the mechanism by which productivity is supposedly increased. I don't have a clue. Having come to A, this is like, you got to be kidding me. B, takes for granted that the characteristics of one prairie plot could reveal something about the characteristics of another prairie plot. Okay, doesn't take that for granted. It's talking about this prairie plot. Bases a general conclusion on data that is likely to be unrepresentative. What's the general conclusion? You're saying as a general principle that where you have rich species and you have rich soil, you have this, okay. Well, if you have that in one plot, it does seem it would flow over to other plots, wouldn't be limited to one plot. And E, it takes an increase in the number to indicate an increase in proportion. Again, you're so dead. If you do not pull the trigger and you're doing analysis both on the argument itself and then on each of the 5 answer choices, you're simply toast. So the answer there is A. Number 10, which one of the following, if true, most weakens the argument? So now I'm into weakening. Okay. A little bit longer here. I have my slash marks. Oh, here you go. In an experiment, 2 groups of undergraduates were taught how to create one of the types of stone tools that the Neanderthals made in prehistoric times. So stop, you gotta, so we're undergraduates and we've been given one of the tools that these folks used, okay. One group, those are the undergraduates, one group was taught using both demonstrations and elaborate verbal explanations, whereas the other group learned by silent example alone. So the teaching method on how to use the tool, one involved language and demonstrations, one just involved demonstrations alone. Okay. The 2 groups showed a significant difference neither in the speed with which they acquired the tool-making skills, nor in the proficiency that they reached. So they both were able to use that specific tool equally well. That's the end of the evidence. Here's the conclusion. This shows that the Neanderthals could just as well have created their sophisticated tools even if they had no language. And you got to stop and say, well, where's the disconnect between the evidence and the conclusion? If you went back to that first sentence, would it be fair to say the students were given one type of tool that the Neanderthals made? Right? And the conclusion is, based on that we can now conclude that the Neanderthals could have created their sophisticated tools even if they had no language. So I'm struggling with here, as I look in that first sentence, I'm not seeing any reference to it being sophisticated. I'm also seeing only a reference to one of the types. So if you say one of the types you get, if we're talking about one of the types of coffee, there are going to be a lot of different types. Okay, so I'm thinking that the flaw there is this is too broad a conclusion. Choice C says the tools that the undergraduates were taught to make were much simpler and easier to make than most types of the tools created by the Neanderthals, and that would severely weaken this argument you're saying, because we gave them something that was very simple. If we had given them something that was more complicated, they might needed to have been able to speak to one another and communicate. So C is going to be the answer. Let's look at the others here. A, apart from the sophistication of their stone tools, there is a great deal of evidence suggesting that the Neanderthals possessed some form of language. That's not relevant to, it was language involved with these tools. B, the students who were taught with verbal explanations were allowed to discuss the tool-making techniques among themselves, whereas the students who learned by silent example were not. Doesn't tell me anything. I mean, if you had language, you could use it. If you didn't have language, your tool came out the same. D, the instructor who taught the group of students who learned by silent example alone was much less proficient at making the stone tools than was the instructor who taught the other group of students. So there's something that does seem to weigh a little bit, that it would create some kind of a disparity, right? That the instructor was less efficient at making the tool, but if they, so maybe that does weaken it, but it's certainly not weakening it to the extent that C is. And again, that you were less proficient doesn't mean the tool, the bottom line is the tools came out equally well. So actually, the more I think about it, that seems to actually strengthen the argument, because you're saying the person who is less gifted in communicating, even if it's non-verbally, those tools came out the same as the other group. So the more I think about it, D's out. And E, the tools created by Neanderthals were much less sophisticated than the tools created by the anatomically modern humans, who almost certainly possessed language and lived at the same time as the Neanderthals, but that's not relevant because we only care about the Neanderthals. So the answer to number 10 is C, and we're done.